The evening sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of the Grand Harmony, one of the most prestigious restaurants in downtown Boston. Sarah Mitchell moved between tables with practiced grace, balancing a tray of expensive wines and artisan dishes. Her black uniform was crisp and professional, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had been working at the Grand Harmony for 3 years now, ever since she moved to the city to pursue her dreams. Sarah was 28 years old, with warm hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Despite the exhausting 12-hour shifts and the sometimes difficult customers, she always maintained her composure. The restaurant was known for hosting wealthy business people, celebrities, and influential personalities. The walls were decorated with photographs of famous musicians who had dined there, and a beautiful grand piano sat on a small stage in the corner, mostly used for professional performances on weekend nights. Tonight was a Thursday, usually a quieter evening, but the restaurant was nearly full. Sarah noticed a particularly loud table near the center of the dining room. 5 well-dressed men sat there, laughing boisterously and calling for more wine every few minutes. The man at the head of the table was Marcus Thornhill, a famous music critic whose reviews could make or break careers. He had salt and pepper hair, an expensive suit, and an expression of permanent disapproval etched on his face. Marcus had written for the most prestigious music publications for over 20 years. He was known in the industry as someone with impeccable taste, but also as someone who showed no mercy to performers he deemed unworthy. His reviews were sharp, often cruel, and he seemed to take pleasure in tearing down musicians who didn't meet his impossibly high standards. Many young artists feared seeing his name attached to their performances. Sarah approached their table with fresh drinks. As she carefully placed a glass of vintage wine in front of Marcus, he barely acknowledged her presence. He was in the middle of a story, telling his companions about a piano recital he had attended the previous week. His voice dripped with contempt as he described the performance. "The woman couldn't even handle Chopin properly," Marcus said, waving his hand dismissively. "Her technique was sloppy, her interpretation shallow. I don't understand how these mediocre talents get stage time at legitimate venues. It's an insult to real musicians." His friends nodded along, though some looked uncomfortable with his harsh words. Sarah finished serving their drinks and was about to leave when Marcus suddenly turned his attention to the grand piano, sitting idle in the corner. A mischievous, almost cruel smile spread across his face. "You know what this place needs?" Marcus announced loudly, ensuring nearby tables could hear. "Some actual entertainment. That piano has been sitting there like a museum piece all evening." He turned in his seat and snapped his fingers at Sarah, who had only made it a few steps away. "You there, waitress? Come here." Sarah turned back, maintaining her professional smile despite the rudeness of his gesture. "Yes, sir?" "Is there something wrong with your order?" "The order is fine," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with an air of superiority. "But this restaurant is dreadfully boring tonight. I see you walking around with nothing better to do. Why don't you entertain us? Go play that piano." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She glanced at the piano, then back at Marcus. "Sir, I'm working right now. I'm a waitress, not a performer." Marcus laughed, and his companions joined in nervously. "Oh, come now. Surely anyone can bang out a few notes. You don't need to be Mozart. Just give us something to listen to while we finish our meal. Consider it part of your service." Other customers were starting to watch now. Sarah felt her cheeks grow warm. She wasn't embarrassed about being a waitress, she was proud of her honest work. But Marcus's tone made it clear he was mocking her. He saw her as beneath him, as someone who existed only to serve people like him. "I really should get back to my other tables," Sarah said politely but firmly. Marcus's expression darkened. He raised his voice slightly. "I'm a regular customer here and I'm making a simple request. Your job is to keep customers happy, isn't it? I'm asking you to play the piano. It's not that complicated." Sarah felt trapped. She could see her manager, Mr. Peterson, watching from across the room with a concerned expression. The last thing she wanted was to cause a scene or make her manager deal with a complaint from an influential customer like Marcus Thornhill. The restaurant's reputation depended on keeping wealthy patrons satisfied. "I suppose I could play something briefly," Sarah said quietly, though her heart was pounding. "Wonderful," Marcus exclaimed, clapping his hands together. "See, that wasn't so hard. Go on then, let's hear what a waitress sounds like on the piano. This should be amusing." His words stung, but Sarah held her head high as she walked toward the stage. The restaurant had grown quieter now, with many customers turning their attention to what was happening. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, and a few seemed entertained by the spectacle Marcus was creating. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she climbed the 3 steps to the small stage. The grand piano gleamed under the soft lights. She hadn't played on a stage in front of people in over 3 years, not since everything had changed in her life. As she approached the bench, memories flooded back, both beautiful and painful. She sat down and adjusted the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. Behind her, she could hear Marcus making comments to his table, though she couldn't make out the exact words. There was laughter. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. What Marcus Thornhill didn't know, what none of these people knew, was that Sarah Mitchell had once been Sarah Chen Mitchell, one of the most promising young pianists in the country. She had studied at Juilliard, won international competitions, and performed in concert halls across America and Europe. Critics had called her a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent. She had been on the verge of signing with a major recording label and booking a world tour. Then, 3 years ago, her world had collapsed. Her father had been diagnosed with advanced cancer, and her mother had suffered a stroke shortly after. Sarah had left everything, her career, her apartment in New York, her agent, her dreams to move back home and care for them. She had used all her savings and sold her own piano to pay for medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. After her parents passed away within months of each other, Sarah had found herself alone, broke and emotionally shattered. The music world moves quickly, and in her absence, newer talents had emerged. Her agent had moved on to other clients. The opportunities that had once seemed endless had vanished. She had moved to Boston to start over, taking the waitressing job to pay rent while she figured out what to do with her life. For 3 years, she hadn't played piano publicly. She couldn't afford to rent practice space, and the few times she had played on the old upright piano at a community center, the memories had been too painful. Music had once been her entire identity, and losing it had felt like losing herself. But now, sitting at this grand piano with dozens of eyes watching her and an arrogant critic waiting to mock her, something stirred inside Sarah. Maybe it was anger at Marcus's cruelty. Maybe it was exhaustion from pretending to be someone she wasn't. Maybe it was simply time to remember who she had once been. Sarah placed her fingers on the keys. The familiar ivory felt like coming home. She took one more deep breath and then she began to play. The first notes that emerged from the piano were soft, almost hesitant. Sarah had chosen Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece she had performed countless times in her previous life. It was beautiful but common enough that Marcus would likely dismiss it as an obvious choice. She could already imagine his condescending comments, but as her fingers moved across the keys, something magical began to happen. The muscle memory that had been dormant for 3 years awakened. Her posture straightened, her shoulders relaxed, and her hands began to move with the fluid grace of someone who had spent thousands of hours mastering their craft. The hesitation in those first few notes melted away, replaced by confidence and emotion. The restaurant fell completely silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Waiters paused in their tracks. Even the kitchen staff, hearing the music through the serving window, stopped what they were doing to listen. The notes floated through the air like silk, each one perfectly placed, the dynamic shifting from whisper-soft to rich and full with masterful control. Sarah's eyes were closed now, and she was no longer in the restaurant. She was back in the concert halls of her past, feeling the joy and freedom that music had always brought her. Her fingers danced across the keys, drawing out every ounce of emotion from the piece. This wasn't just technically perfect playing, this was artistry. Every phrase was shaped with intention, every transition seamless. The piano seemed to sing under her touch. At Marcus's table, the laughter had died away. His companions stared at the stage with their mouths slightly open. Marcus himself had gone very still, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. His expression had changed from amused superiority to something else entirely. Confusion, then slowly dawning recognition. This wasn't what he had expected at all. The other diners were equally mesmerized. A woman at a nearby table had tears streaming down her face. An elderly gentleman closed his eyes, transported by the music. A young couple held hands, both completely still, afraid that even the slightest movement might break the spell. The music washed over everyone in waves, carrying them away from their everyday worries and concerns. Mr. Peterson, the restaurant manager, stood near the kitchen entrance with his hand over his mouth. He had hired Sarah 3 years ago based on her solid work ethic and friendly demeanor. She had never mentioned anything about being a musician. He had no idea he had a world-class pianist working as one of his waitresses. He watched in amazement as his employee transformed before his eyes. As the piece approached its most tender moment, Sarah's touch became impossibly delicate. The notes seemed to float rather than strike, creating an atmosphere of such beauty that several people in the restaurant found themselves holding their breath. Her left hand provided a gentle, rolling accompaniment while her right hand sang out the melody with exquisite clarity. The dynamics were perfect, never too loud or too soft, always serving the emotion of the music. The technical difficulty of what she was doing would have been apparent to any trained musician. The control required to play so softly while maintaining clarity, the perfect balance between the hands, the subtle rubato that made the rhythm breathe naturally. These were things that took years of dedicated practice to achieve. This wasn't someone who had taken a few piano lessons as a child. This was a master at work. Marcus leaned forward in his seat, his critical ear now fully engaged. He had reviewed thousands of performances in his career, and he knew exceptional playing when he heard it. The interpretation was mature and thoughtful, showing deep understanding of the composer's intentions. The technique was flawless, the tone beautiful. But more than that, there was something intangible in the performance, a genuine emotional connection that couldn't be faked or taught. His mind raced as he tried to place where he might have heard this level of playing before. The style seemed familiar somehow, the particular way she voiced the chords, the specific choices in phrasing. It nagged at him, a memory just out of reach. He prided himself on knowing the classical music world inside and out, every important performer, every rising talent. Had he reviewed someone who played like this? As Sarah moved into the final section of the piece, building back up from the delicate middle section, her body swayed slightly with the music. Her face, which customers only ever saw bearing a polite service smile, now showed raw emotion. There was joy there and sadness and something like relief. It was as if she had been holding her breath for 3 years and was finally allowing herself to breathe again. The other waitstaff had gathered near the edges of the room, watching their colleague with a mixture of shock and pride. Maria, who had trained Sarah when she first started, wiped away tears. James, the head waiter, shook his head in disbelief. They had worked alongside Sarah for years, sharing jokes during busy shifts, complaining about difficult customers, supporting each other through tough days. None of them had suspected she was hiding this incredible talent. The music swelled toward its conclusion, and Sarah's hands moved with increasing passion across the keyboard. The piano responded to her touch like a living thing, producing a rich, resonant sound that filled every corner of the restaurant. The final phrases descended like gentle rain, each note placed with perfect timing, the dynamics fading away until the last chord hung in the air like a question. Sarah held the final note, letting it ring out and slowly decay into silence. Even after the sound had completely faded, no one moved. The silence in the restaurant was profound, almost sacred. For several long seconds, nobody seemed to breathe. Then, as if a spell had been broken, someone started clapping. Then another person. Within seconds, the entire restaurant had erupted into thunderous applause. People stood from their tables, giving Sarah a standing ovation. The elderly gentleman was openly weeping. The young couple clutched each other, both clearly moved. Even the kitchen staff pushed through the doors to applaud, their chef's whites creating a line of white against the elegant dining room. Sarah opened her eyes, seeming to wake from a dream. She looked around at the standing crowd, appearing almost confused by the response. Her hands were still resting on the keys, trembling slightly now that the performance was over. The magnitude of what she had just done was beginning to sink in. She had played again, really played for the first time in 3 years. Mr. Peterson was clapping enthusiastically, a huge smile on his face. The other waiters were cheering. Customers were whistling and calling out praise. The applause continued for what felt like several minutes, wave after wave of appreciation washing over the small stage. At his table, Marcus Thornhill slowly rose to his feet. His face had gone pale and his expression was complicated, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something that might have been respect. He was clapping too, but mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. His companions looked between him and Sarah uncertainly, not sure how their friend would react to being so thoroughly proven wrong. Sarah stood from the piano bench, still somewhat dazed. She gave a small, graceful bow, a gesture that came from years of performance training. The applause somehow grew even louder. Several customers were calling out, "More! Play more!" But Sarah stepped away from the piano, descending the 3 stairs from the stage on shaky legs. As she walked back across the dining room floor, customers reached out to touch her arm or shoulder as she passed, offering congratulations and thanks. An older woman grabbed her hand and said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." A businessman pressed his business card into her palm, saying something about representation that Sarah barely registered. She was heading back toward the server's station, trying to process what had just happened when she found her path blocked. Marcus Thornhill stood directly in front of her, his expensive suit and commanding presence suddenly seeming less intimidating. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant had quieted again, sensing drama. Everyone wanted to see what the famous critic would say to the waitress who had just delivered one of the most stunning performances any of them had ever witnessed. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but for perhaps the first time in his career, the man who made his living from words found himself at a loss. Sarah met his gaze steadily, her chin raised, waiting to hear what he could possibly say after what he had just witnessed. The air between them crackled with tension, and the entire restaurant held its breath once more. Marcus Thornhill stared at Sarah with an expression that shifted between embarrassment and intense scrutiny. His trained ear had caught something familiar in her performance, something that tugged at his memory. He took a step closer, studying her face more carefully now, looking past the waitress uniform and tired eyes to see the person beneath. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter than before, lacking the arrogant edge it had carried earlier. "I know that playing. I've heard you perform before, haven't I?" Sarah felt her heart race. She had hoped to avoid this moment, this recognition. For 3 years, she had been invisible, just another face in the service industry. But there was no hiding now. She could see in Marcus's eyes that he was piecing it together, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he remembered. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said simply, her voice steady despite her nerves. Marcus's eyes widened. "Mitchell? Sarah Chen Mitchell? The Juilliard prodigy?" His voice rose with sudden recognition. "You won the Van Cliburn competition 7 years ago. You performed at Carnegie Hall. I reviewed your performance of Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto. I called it one of the finest interpretations I'd heard in a decade." The other customers began whispering among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, clearly searching for information. Within seconds, several people were reading about Sarah's past, her awards, her acclaimed performances. The whispers grew louder as the story spread through the restaurant. Sarah nodded slowly. "That was a long time ago." "A long time ago?" Marcus repeated, his professional persona reasserting itself. "You were 23 years old at the beginning of what should have been a legendary career. You were going to record with Deutsche Grammophon. There were talks of a world tour. Then you just disappeared." He paused, his expression shifting to something like concern. "What happened to you?" The question hung in the air. Sarah felt dozens of pairs of eyes on her, waiting for an explanation. She hadn't spoken about her past to anyone in Boston. Her co-workers knew nothing about it. Even her landlord only knew her as a quiet tenant who always paid rent on time. The life of Sarah Chen Mitchell, the celebrated pianist, felt like it belonged to a different person entirely. "Life happened," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying a weight of emotion she couldn't quite hide. "My parents got sick. They needed me, so I came home to take care of them. The music world doesn't wait for anyone, Mr. Thornhill. You know that better than most." Marcus's face shifted again, and for perhaps the first time since Sarah had met him that evening, she saw genuine human emotion there, something that looked like regret. He glanced back at his table where his companions were watching with rapt attention, then turned back to Sarah. "I owe you an apology," he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "What I said earlier, how I treated you, it was inexcusable. I was being cruel for my own amusement, and I'm sorry." The apology seemed to cost him something, his pride perhaps. Several customers nodded approvingly, but Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to accept it. His words earlier had stung not because of who she used to be, but because of how he had dismissed her as unworthy of basic respect. simply because she was a waitress. You didn't know who I was, Sarah said carefully. But would it have mattered if I was just a waitress with no performance background? Did that make it okay to mock me? The question clearly caught Marcus off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Around them, customers watched this exchange with fascination. It wasn't often that someone challenged Marcus Thornhill so directly. No, he admitted finally. No, it wouldn't have been okay regardless. I've spent so long being the person who judges others that I've forgotten basic decency. That's on me. He paused, then added, but I still don't understand. With talent like yours, why are you working here? Why aren't you performing? Before Sarah could answer, Mr. Peterson approached, his face flushed with excitement. Sarah, I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me? We could have, you should be performing here regularly. We host concerts on weekends. I can book you immediately. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Just 30 minutes ago, she had been invisible, moving between tables unnoticed. Now everyone wanted something from her. An explanation, a performance, a return to her former life. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing about her situation was simple. I appreciate that, Mr. Peterson, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice level. But I'm happy with my current position. I enjoy waitressing. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. She had found a strange peace in the simple routine of her work. There were no expectations, no pressure to be exceptional, no fear of failing to live up to her potential. The music had brought her so much joy, but also so much pain. Walking away from it had been devastating, but also liberating in its own way. Marcus shook his head, clearly frustrated. That's absurd. You have a gift that maybe one person in a million possesses. You can't just waste it serving food. His words sparked something in Sarah, a flash of the anger she had been suppressing. Waste it? Is that what you think I'm doing? Mr. Thornhill, do you have any idea what it costs to be a professional musician? The practice space, the coaching, the competition fees, the concert attire, the travel. I used every penny I had to take care of my parents. I have student loans, rent, basic bills to pay. Playing piano at your level requires resources I simply don't have anymore. The restaurant had gone quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. People were truly listening now, understanding perhaps for the first time the harsh realities behind artistic careers. It was easy to admire talent, to consume art, but few people thought about what it took to create it. And even if I could afford it, Sarah continued, her voice strengthening, the classical music world isn't exactly welcoming to people who take 3-year breaks. I missed my window. New talents emerge every year, younger and hungrier. I'm 28 now, which might as well be ancient in competition terms. The opportunities I had before are gone. Marcus looked thoughtful. He pulled out his phone and began typing something. What if I told you that's not necessarily true? What are you doing? Sarah asked, suspicious. I'm texting my contact at the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Marcus said, still typing. They have a chamber music series that's always looking for exceptional soloists. The pay isn't extraordinary, but it's legitimate work, and it could lead to other opportunities. I also know several people who would be interested in offering you coaching sessions pro bono, if you're interested in getting back into shape performance-wise. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and fear rise in her chest. Why would you do that? 5 minutes ago you were making fun of me. Marcus looked up from his phone, meeting her eyes directly. Because I'm a critic, which means I'm supposed to recognize and promote exceptional talent when I encounter it. What you just played wasn't just good, it was remarkable. The technical skill is still there, obviously, but more importantly, you have something that can't be taught. Genuine artistry, mature interpretation, emotional depth, he paused. And because I was wrong about you, and I'd like to do something to make that right. One of Marcus's companions from his table approached. A woman in an elegant dress who Sarah hadn't paid much attention to before. I'm Rebecca Chen, she said, extending her hand. I run a foundation that provides grants and support for artists facing financial hardship. I'd like to talk to you about your situation if you're open to it. More people began approaching. A man introduced himself as a recording engineer who had worked with several major classical labels. A woman who ran a prestigious music festival in Vermont. A retired piano teacher who offered to let Sarah use his studio space for practice. The restaurant had transformed into an impromptu networking event, all centered around Sarah. Mr. Peterson watched with a bemused smile. I think you're going to need to take a break from your shift, he told Sarah. Go talk to these people. I'll handle your tables. Sarah felt dizzy from the sudden reversal of fortune. An hour ago, she had been a struggling waitress trying to make it through another shift. Now she was surrounded by people offering opportunities she had thought were lost forever. It was too much, too fast. She needed time to think, to process what was happening. Thank you all, she said, her voice slightly shaky. This is incredibly generous, but I need some time to consider everything. This is a lot to take in. Marcus nodded understandingly. Of course, but please take my card. He pulled out an elegant business card and handed it to her. Call me tomorrow. I'm serious about the BSO connection, and I'd like to write a piece about you for Musical America. Your story, the talent, the comeback. It's exactly the kind of thing that could generate real interest and opportunities. Sarah took the card, her hand trembling slightly. She looked around at all the faces, some familiar from serving them throughout the evening, others new. They were all looking at her with respect, admiration, even awe. It was a stark contrast to the dismissive way Marcus had summoned her to the piano earlier. As the crowd began to disperse back to their tables, still buzzing with conversation about what they had witnessed, Sarah found a quiet corner near the kitchen. She needed a moment alone to collect herself. Her co-worker. Sarah barely slept that night. She lay in her small studio apartment, staring at the ceiling as her mind replayed the evening's events over and over. The business cards she had collected sat in a neat stack on her bedside table, each one representing a different possible future. Marcus Thornhill's card lay on top, his elegant script somehow both inviting and intimidating. The apartment was modest, a far cry from the nice place she had once rented in New York during her rising career. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through the wall. Her furniture came from thrift stores and sidewalk finds. There was barely room for the twin bed, a small table, and a single chair. She had no piano, which sometimes felt like living without a limb and other times felt like a relief. Her phone had been buzzing constantly since she got home. The restaurant customers who had witnessed her performance had apparently spread the word on social media. Someone had recorded part of her performance on their phone, and the video was making rounds on various platforms. By the time Sarah had checked her phone before bed, the video had been viewed thousands of times with comments flooding in from around the world. Is this really Sarah Chen Mitchell? I saw her perform in Vienna 6 years ago. She was incredible then and apparently still is. Where has she been? Why is she working as a waitress? This is what happens when we don't support our artists properly. The comments ranged from supportive to curious to critical. Some people praised her performance while others questioned her life choices. A few classical music forums were buzzing with speculation about her disappearance from the scene and theories about her potential comeback. It was overwhelming and invasive, yet also strangely validating. People still remembered her. Her work had mattered. As dawn broke and pale light filtered through her small window, Sarah finally gave up on sleep. She made coffee in her ancient coffee maker and sat at her small table, Marcus's business card in her hands. The logical part of her brain said she should call him immediately, seize these opportunities before they disappeared like morning mist. But the fearful part, the part that had been hurt and disappointed and overwhelmed, urged caution. What if she tried to return to music and failed? What if her skills had deteriorated more than last night's single performance suggested? What if the pressure and expectations crushed her again? She had built a safe, predictable life as a waitress. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Was she really ready to risk that stability for the uncertain world of professional music? Her phone rang, making her jump. It was Mr. Peterson, her manager at the Grand Harmony. Sarah, I hope I'm not calling too early, he said, his voice warm but professional. I wanted to talk to you about last night. That performance was extraordinary, and I think we should discuss your future with the restaurant. Sarah's heart sank slightly. She liked Mr. Peterson and didn't want to disappoint him, but she could sense where this was heading. I'd like to offer you a position as our featured pianist, Mr. Peterson continued. You would still do some waitressing if needed, but primarily you would perform on Friday and Saturday evenings. The pay would be better, and honestly, having a talent like you could really elevate the restaurant's profile. What do you think? It was a generous offer, more than fair, but something about it felt wrong to Sarah. Performing at the restaurant felt like a middle ground, neither fully embracing her past as a serious musician, nor maintaining the clean separation she had worked hard to create. It felt like being stuck between two worlds. "Can I think about it?" Sarah asked. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Peterson, I really do. But I need some time to figure out what I want." "Of course," he said, though she could hear the disappointment in his voice. "Take the time you need. But Sarah, whatever you decide about performing, you'll always have your waitressing job here if you want it. You've been a valuable employee and that won't change." After hanging up, Sarah felt even more confused. She had spent 3 years avoiding major decisions, just surviving day by day. Now suddenly she was being forced to choose a direction, and every option seemed to come with enormous consequences. By mid-morning, she couldn't avoid it any longer. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on Marcus Thornhill's card. He answered on the second ring. "Sarah," he said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I hoped you would call. Have you had time to think about my offer?" "I have," Sarah said, "but I have questions." "A lot of questions. Ask away," Marcus replied. "I'm at my office. Why don't you come by? We can talk properly, and I can introduce you to some people who might be helpful." 2 hours later, Sarah found herself in Marcus's office in a historic building downtown. The space was exactly what she had expected. Walls lined with books about music, framed concert posters, photographs of Marcus with famous musicians. His desk was covered with papers, journals, and what looked like multiple ongoing reviews. Marcus greeted her warmly, a stark contrast to the arrogant man from the restaurant. He gestured to a comfortable chair and poured them both coffee from an expensive-looking machine. "I want to start by apologizing again," Marcus said, sitting across from her. "I've thought a lot about last night, and I'm embarrassed by how I treated you. It was inexcusable." Sarah nodded, accepting the apology more fully now. "Thank you. That means something." "Now," Marcus continued, pulling out a notebook, "let's talk about your career. I've made some calls this morning, and I have concrete opportunities to discuss. But first, I need to know what you want. Do you want to return to the performance world? Because if you don't, if you're genuinely happy with your life as it is, then I'll respect that and leave you alone." It was the question Sarah had been avoiding, the one she needed to answer for herself before she could move forward. She thought about the feeling of playing last night, the way her body had remembered every movement, the joy that had flooded through her as the music poured out. She thought about the 3 years of silence, the way she had locked away that part of herself. "I miss it," she admitted quietly. "I miss playing, performing, the connection with audiences. I miss being part of the music community. But I'm also terrified. The last time I was in this world, I lost everything. My parents got sick, and I had to choose between my career and taking care of them. That choice nearly destroyed me." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "That must have been incredibly difficult. But Sarah, you need to understand something. The choice you made to care for your parents, that wasn't a failure. That was you being a good daughter and a good human being. The music world might not have waited for you, but that doesn't mean you did anything wrong." The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. For 3 years, she had carried guilt about abandoning her career, as if choosing family over professional success had been a moral failure. Hearing Marcus, a man whose opinion carried weight in the classical music world, validate her choice felt like a weight lifting. "The Boston Symphony Orchestra's chamber music series I mentioned," Marcus continued. "They're interested in having you perform a recital next month. It would be a small venue, maybe 200 seats, but it's a legitimate classical music audience. The artistic director, Catherine Walsh, is a friend of mine. I sent her that video from last night, and she wants to meet you." "Next month?" Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. "That's so soon. I haven't practiced seriously in 3 years. I'd need time to prepare, to build my stamina back, to work on repertoire. Which is why I've also arranged for you to work with Thomas Brennan," Marcus said. "He's one of the best piano coaches in the city. He's agreed to give you intensive sessions, no charge, because he believes in supporting returning artists. He has a studio where you can practice." Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes. These were the exact resources she had needed but couldn't afford. "Why are you doing all this? You don't even know me." "I told you last night," Marcus said simply. "It's my job to recognize and promote exceptional talent. And frankly, I'm trying to be a better person. I've spent too many years tearing people down with my reviews. Maybe it's time I helped build someone up instead." Over the next hour, Marcus outlined a potential plan. The recital next month would be a test, a way to see if Sarah still had what it took to perform at a high level. If it went well, There were other opportunities waiting. Rebecca Chen's foundation could provide financial support for living expenses, while Sarah got back on her feet. Several music schools had expressed interest in having her teach, which could provide steady income while she rebuilt her performance career. It was more than Sarah had dared to hope for. But there was still one problem. I'm scared, she admitted. What if I fail? What if I get up there and freeze? What if my playing isn't good enough anymore? Last night was one piece in a low-pressure environment where nobody expected anything. A real recital is different. Marcus smiled slightly. Do you know how many professional musicians deal with performance anxiety? Almost all of them. Fear is normal, Sarah. It's what you do with that fear that matters. You can let it paralyze you, keep you safe but unfulfilled. Or you can use it, let it sharpen your focus and drive you to prepare thoroughly. Sarah looked out Marcus's office window at the city below. People hurried along the sidewalks. The next morning, Sarah stood outside Thomas Brennan's studio, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The building was in an older part of Boston, a converted warehouse that now housed several artist spaces. She could hear music drifting from various studios as she climbed the stairs to the third floor, a violinist practicing scales, a soprano running through vocal exercises, the distant sound of a cello. Thomas's studio door was slightly ajar and she knocked gently before entering. The space took her breath away. A magnificent Steinway grand piano dominated the room, positioned near tall windows that flooded the space with natural light. The walls were covered with photographs of famous pianists, concert posters, and shelves lined with sheet music. It looked like the kind of place where serious music happened. Thomas Brennan himself was in his late 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood from the piano bench where he had been playing and crossed the room to greet her with a warm handshake. Sarah Chen Mitchell, he said with a smile. I've been looking forward to meeting you. I saw your performance at Carnegie Hall 6 years ago. The Rachmaninoff was spectacular. Sarah felt a flush of pleasure mixed with sadness. That performance felt like it had been done by a different person. Someone younger and more confident, someone whose life hadn't yet fallen apart. Thank you, she said, though I'm not sure I'm that pianist anymore. Well, Thomas said, gesturing to the piano. Let's find out who you are now. Play something for me, whatever you'd like. Sarah approached the piano with trembling hands. The Steinway was beautiful, clearly well-maintained and recently tuned. She sat on the bench and tried to settle her nerves. After a moment's consideration, she began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had always felt like home to her. As she played, Thomas listened intently, occasionally walking around the piano to observe her hand position and posture from different angles. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before he spoke. The good news is that your fundamental technique is still solid, Thomas said, sitting beside her on the bench. Your touch is beautiful, your phrasing is mature, and you clearly understand the music deeply. The less good news is that you've developed some tension in your shoulders, probably from waitressing, and your stamina needs work. Your fingers also tire toward the end of pieces, which suggests you haven't been maintaining the physical conditioning that piano requires. Sarah nodded, having noticed these issues herself. Can we fix it? In time for the recital? We can certainly improve it significantly, Thomas said. But you need to be realistic about what's possible in 1 month. You won't be back to peak performance level, but you can definitely deliver a strong recital if you're willing to work hard. And I mean very hard. Several hours of focused practice daily, exercises to rebuild stamina, work on relaxation techniques to release that shoulder tension. Over the next hour, Thomas outlined a rigorous training schedule. Sarah would practice at his studio every morning for 4 hours, working through technical exercises, scales, and etudes to rebuild her finger strength and agility. In the afternoons, she would work on repertoire for the recital. Thomas would coach her 3 times a week, helping refine her interpretations and address technical challenges. What about money? Sarah asked hesitantly. Marcus said you were doing this pro bono, but this is a huge commitment of your time and resources. Thomas smiled. Marcus didn't lie. I'm doing this because I believe in supporting artists who are trying to rebuild their careers. I've seen too many talented musicians lost to circumstance. If I can help prevent that, it's worth my time. Besides, he added with a twinkle in his eye, I'm retired from performing myself now. Coaching gives me purpose and keeps me connected to music. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the generosity. I don't know how to thank you. Thank me by working hard and delivering a beautiful recital, Thomas said firmly. That's all the thanks I need. Now let's talk repertoire. What are you thinking of performing? For the rest of the afternoon, they discussed pieces. Sarah wanted to include the Debussy Clair de Lune that she had played at the restaurant, as a sort of acknowledgement of where this comeback had started. They also chose Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique for its emotional depth and technical challenges, and several shorter works by Schubert and Brahms. It would be about an hour of music total, enough to showcase Sarah's range without being overwhelming for her first performance back. That evening, Sarah returned to the Grand Harmony for what might be one of her last shifts as a full-time waitress. She had spoken with Mr. Peterson earlier, explaining her decision to pursue the recital and potential comeback. He had been disappointed but understanding, agreeing to keep her on part-time so she could maintain some income while preparing. Her co-workers had been buzzing about her performance ever since that night. Maria pulled her aside during a quiet moment. "So you're really going for it?" Maria asked, her expression mixing excitement with concern. "Getting back into the music world?" "I'm going to try," Sarah said. "I don't know if it will work out, but I have to try." "Does that make sense?" Maria hugged her tightly. "It makes perfect sense. We'll miss having you around as much, but girl, we all saw what you can do. You belong on a stage, not just carrying plates." The weeks that followed became a blur of intense practice and gradual improvement. Every morning, Sarah arrived at Thomas's studio at 8 o'clock sharp. She began with technical exercises, Hanon studies and scales, the kind of tedious work that was necessary but not glamorous. Her fingers ached at first, unused to such sustained playing. Her back and shoulders protested the long hours at the piano, but slowly, steadily, her body remembered. The muscle memory that had been dormant began to reawaken. Her fingers grew stronger, more agile. The pieces that had felt impossible in the first week began to feel manageable by the third. Thomas was an exacting but encouraging teacher, praising her progress while never letting her settle for less than her best. Again, he would say, when she rushed through a difficult passage, "Feel the rhythm in your body. The music should flow, not run." Or, "Beautiful phrasing, but watch your dynamics here. You're playing everything at the same volume. Remember, the piano is called a pianoforte for a reason. We need both soft and loud." Catherine Walsh, the artistic director of the BSO Chamber series, came to observe one of her practice sessions 2 weeks before the recital. Sarah was terrified, feeling like she was back in a competition being judged, but Catherine's response was enthusiastic. "Marcus wasn't exaggerating," Catherine said after hearing Sarah play through several pieces. "You have real artistry, Sarah. This recital is going to be special." As the recital date approached, Sarah noticed changes beyond just her piano playing. She was standing straighter, smiling more genuinely. The cloud of depression that had hung over her for 3 years was beginning to lift. She realized that music hadn't just been her career. It had been her identity, her way of processing emotions, her connection to something larger than herself. Without it, she had been merely surviving, not truly living. But the return to music also brought back painful memories. Sometimes, in the middle of practicing, she would think about her parents and have to stop playing, tears streaming down her face. She remembered playing for her father in the hospital, how he had smiled despite his pain, how proud he had been of her. She remembered her mother saying, just weeks before the stroke, "Don't give up your music for us, sweetheart. We want you to shine." Thomas found her crying one afternoon, her hands frozen over the keys. He sat beside her quietly, not speaking, just present. After several minutes, Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at him. "I feel guilty," she admitted. "Guilty that I gave up music when they got sick. Guilty that I'm going back to it now that they're gone. Like I failed them either way." Thomas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Grief is complicated, Sarah. But I think your parents would want you to play, to use this gift you have. You honored them by caring for them when they needed you. Now honor them by living fully, by sharing your music with the world. That's not failure. That's love, past and present." The words helped, though the grief never completely left. Sarah began to understand that she could hold both things simultaneously. Sadness for what she had lost and joy in what she was reclaiming. They didn't cancel each other out. They were simply both part of her story now. 3 days before the recital, Marcus published his article in Musical America. Sarah had been nervous about what he might write, worried he would focus on her struggles or paint her as a tragic figure. But when she read the piece, she found it was thoughtful and respectful, focusing on her talent and resilience rather than just her hardships. Sarah Chen Mitchell, "The Comeback That Reminds Us Why Classical Music Matters," read the headline. The article described her performance at the restaurant, but also her earlier career, the circumstances that led to her hiatus, and the upcoming recital. Marcus wrote eloquently about second chances and the importance of supporting artists through difficult periods. He ended with a powerful paragraph. "In a world that often treats artists as disposable, that expects constant productivity, and punishes those who step away for any reason, Sarah Chen." The day of the recital dawned gray and drizzly, typical Boston weather for late autumn. Sarah woke up with her stomach in knots, having managed only a few hours of fitful sleep. She went through her morning routine mechanically, trying to conserve her mental and emotional energy for the performance that evening. She ate a light breakfast, practiced gentle stretches that Thomas had taught her to relax her shoulders, and tried to keep her mind from spiraling into panic. At noon, she met Thomas at his studio for a final run-through. He had advised against playing the full program to avoid tiring her hands, so instead they worked through just the opening and closing pieces, focusing on settling her nerves more than perfecting her technique. "Remember," Thomas said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, "you've done the work. The preparation is complete. Now you just need to trust yourself and let the music flow. Don't think too much, Phil. What if I mess up?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had been circling in her mind all morning. "What if my fingers freeze or I forget the music or I'm just not good enough anymore?" Thomas smiled kindly. "Then you'll recover and keep going. Every pianist, no matter how experienced, makes mistakes. What separates good performers from great ones isn't perfection. It's how they handle imperfection. If something goes wrong, breathe, find your place, and continue. The audience is on your side, Sarah. They want you to succeed." The afternoon crept by with agonizing slowness. Sarah tried to rest but couldn't relax. She tried to read but couldn't focus. Finally, at 4 o'clock, she began getting ready. She had bought a new concert dress with some of the advance money from Catherine, a simple but elegant black gown that made her feel like a performer again. As she styled her hair and applied minimal makeup, she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. Gone was the tired waitress in a practical uniform. In her place stood someone who looked confident. Professional, artistic Maria and several other co-workers from the Grand. Harmony had bought tickets and promised to attend. Mr. Peterson had given them all the evening off so they could support Sarah. The thought of friendly faces in the audience helped calm her nerves slightly. At 6 o'clock, Thomas picked her up and drove her to the venue, a beautiful historic performance hall affiliated with the Boston Symphony. Sarah had performed in grander venues before at Carnegie Hall and European concert halls, but somehow this modest 200-seat space felt more intimidating. So much rode on tonight's performance. Backstage, Catherine Walsh greeted her warmly. "The house is completely full," she said with an excited smile. "And there are at least 30 people on the waiting list hoping for last-minute cancellations. Sarah, you've generated real buzz with this comeback. People are genuinely excited to hear you play." The words were meant to be encouraging but only increased Sarah's anxiety. She paced the small backstage area, shaking out her hands, trying to steady her breathing. Through the walls, she could hear the murmur of the arriving audience, the rustle of programs, occasional laughter. In 30 minutes, she would walk onto that stage and either prove she still had what it took to be a professional musician or demonstrate that her time had passed. Marcus Thornhill appeared, backstage 15 minutes before the performance. He was dressed formally and carried a small bouquet of flowers. "I wanted to wish you luck," he said, offering her the flowers, "and to tell you that whatever happens tonight, you should be proud of yourself for having the courage to do this. It takes real bravery to step back into an arena where you've previously experienced both triumph and loss." "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting the flowers with trembling hands. "I'm terrified." "Good," Marcus said with a slight smile. "Fear means you care. It means this matters. Use that energy when you play. Channel it into the music. Some of my most memorable performances have been by musicians who were visibly nervous but played with incredible passion because of it." At 7 o'clock sharp, Catherine stepped onto the stage to introduce the performance. Sarah stood in the wings, her heart hammering so hard she thought the audience might hear it. She could see the profile of the piano on stage, illuminated by warm spotlights. Beyond it, rows of faces waited in the darkened auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine's voice rang out clear and warm, "thank you for joining us for this very special recital. Tonight we have the privilege of welcoming back to the stage a pianist who many of you may remember from her earlier career. Sarah Chen Mitchell is a Juilliard graduate, Van Cliburn competition winner, and has performed in major venues around the world. After a hiatus caring for family, she is returning to share her extraordinary gift with us once again. Please give a warm welcome to Sarah Chen Mitchell." The applause was immediate and encouraging. Sarah took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked onto the stage. The lights were bright after the dim backstage area, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust. She could make out faces in the front rows, Thomas beaming with pride, Marcus watching intently, Maria and her co-workers grinning and giving her thumbs up. Other faces she didn't recognize but who were all looking at her with anticipation and goodwill. She reached the piano, turned to the audience, and gave a deep, graceful bow. The applause continued for a moment longer, then faded to expectant silence. Sarah sat on the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed her hands on her lap for a moment. This was it. Everything she had worked for over the past month. Everything she had given up 3 years ago. Everything she hoped to reclaim. It all came down to the next hour. She placed her fingers on the keys and began the opening piece, the Debussy Clair de Lune. The first notes emerged soft and delicate, and immediately Sarah felt something shift inside her. The nervousness didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed into focused energy. Her hands knew what to do. They had played this piece hundreds of times, and they remembered. As she moved through the familiar phrases, Sarah felt herself relax into the music. The audience faded away, the pressure receded, and there was only the piano and the notes and the emotion she was pouring into each phrase. The piece built and swelled, the melodies interweaving, the harmonies rich and complex. This was why she had become a pianist, for this feeling of complete connection with the music, of being a vessel through which something beautiful could flow into the world. The Debussy concluded with the same gentle whisper it had begun with. Sarah held the final chord, letting it fade naturally into silence. Then came the applause, warm and genuine. She hadn't frozen. She hadn't failed. She had played well. She could feel it in her bones. The Beethoven Pathétique came next, a much more demanding piece technically and emotionally. The dramatic opening chords rang out powerfully, and Sarah felt her confidence growing. Her fingers flew across the keys in the fast passages, executing runs and arpeggios with precision. In the slow movement, she poured all her grief and longing into the music, thinking of her parents, of lost years, of dreams deferred. Some audience members were visibly moved, dabbing at their eyes. As she progressed through the program, playing Schubert and Brahms, Sarah felt herself hitting a groove she hadn't experienced since before her hiatus. This was what performance felt like at its best. When technique became invisible and only the music remained, when the connection between performer and audience created something magical that existed only in that moment. There was one difficult moment in the Brahms intermezzo, when her fingers momentarily tangled and she played a wrong note. For a split second, panic threatened to take over, but then Thomas's words echoed in her mind. Breathe, find your place, continue. She did exactly that, smoothly recovering and moving forward. Most of the audience probably hadn't even noticed the mistake, and those who did would have seen how professionally she handled it. The final piece was Chopin's Revolutionary Etude, a powerhouse work that would showcase the technical skills she had worked so hard to rebuild over the past month. Sarah launched into it with fierce energy, her hands flying across the keyboard. The left hand thundered with running passages while the right hand sang out the melody. It was exhausting, demanding every ounce of stamina and concentration she possessed. As she played the final crashing chords and the music came to its triumphant conclusion, Sarah felt a surge of pure joy. She had done it. She had returned to the stage and delivered a complete professional recital. Whatever happened next, she had proven to herself that she was still a pianist, still capable of moving audiences with her playing. The applause that erupted was thunderous. People rose to their feet immediately, giving her a standing ovation. Sarah stood and bowed, feeling tears streaming down her face that she made no attempt to hide. These weren't tears of sadness, but of release, of accomplishment, of coming home to herself after a long journey through darkness. Brava! Someone shouted from the audience. Others took up the call. The applause continued for several minutes, wave after wave of appreciation. Catherine appeared at the edge of the stage, beaming and gesturing for Sarah to take another bow. Sarah obliged, overwhelmed by the response. When the applause finally began to subside, someone called out, "Encore!" The cry was picked up by others until it became a rhythmic chant. Encore! 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 Sarah hadn't prepared an encore piece, assuming. The morning after the recital, Sarah woke to her phone buzzing incessantly. Still groggy from the emotional exhaustion of the previous evening, she checked her messages and found dozens of notifications. The reviews had started coming in, and they were overwhelmingly positive. Marcus's review in Musical America was the first she read. True to his word, he had written an honest but glowing assessment of her performance. He praised her technical proficiency, noting that while she might not quite be at the peak form she had displayed earlier in her career, her interpretation had gained depth and emotional maturity. He described the performance as a masterclass in resilience, proving that true artistry only deepens with life experience. Other reviews echoed similar sentiments. The Boston Globe's critic called it a triumphant return that reminds us of the heights classical piano performance can reach. A prominent classical music blog wrote, "Sarah Chen Mitchell didn't just play the piano last night. She opened her heart and shared her journey with us, and we were all better for it." But it wasn't just the professional critics who were responding. Social media was flooded with videos and comments from audience members. Someone had captured her encore performance of Troy Marai on their phone, and it had been viewed over 100,000 times by morning. The comment section was filled with people sharing their own stories of loss and comeback, of dreams deferred and then reclaimed. Sarah sat in bed, reading through the messages, feeling both grateful and overwhelmed. Her phone rang and she saw it was Catherine Walsh. "Sarah, I hope I'm not calling too early," Catherine said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I've been fielding calls all morning. We have 3 different venues wanting to book you for performances, 2 music festivals interested in having you participate, and several recording companies asking if you have representation. This is just the beginning, Sarah. Your comeback is real." Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined just a month earlier. Rebecca Chen's foundation had approved her grant application, providing her with enough financial support to reduce her waitressing shifts to just 1 night per week. She kept that single shift partly for the income, but mostly because she had grown to care about her co-workers at the Grand Harmony, and she didn't want to completely leave that community behind. Thomas continued working with her, helping her expand her repertoire and prepare for upcoming performances. The intensive month of preparation had been just the beginning. Now she was building back the stamina and skills for a sustained career. She practiced 4 to 5 hours daily, not with the desperate urgency of preparing for a comeback recital, but with the steady discipline of a professional musician. Marcus had become an unexpected ally and friend. His initial cruelty at the restaurant seemed like a distant memory now, though Sarah would never forget the lesson it had taught her about how people treat those they perceive as beneath them. Marcus himself seemed changed by the experience. In his subsequent reviews and articles, there was a new thoughtfulness, a recognition that every artist has a story, and those stories deserve respect. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after her recital, Sarah sat in a coffee shop with Marcus, discussing her upcoming performance at the Vermont festival Rebecca Chen had connected her with. "I've been thinking about that night at the restaurant," Marcus said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "About how I treated you. I've apologized, but I want you to know that you fundamentally changed how I approach my work as a critic. I realized that I had become so focused on judging performances that I had forgotten to honor the human beings creating the art." Sarah nodded. "I appreciate that. You know what's interesting? As terrible as that moment was, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to try a comeback if it hadn't happened. You forced me to confront what I had been avoiding for 3 years. In a strange way, your arrogance gave me back my music. I'd like to think my apology and subsequent help played a role too," Marcus said with a slight smile. "They did," Sarah agreed. "But the initial push, as cruel as it was, mattered too. Sometimes we need to be pushed off the cliff to remember we know how to fly." Sarah had been invited to teach a masterclass at a local music school, working with young pianists who were preparing for competitions. As she worked with these students, she found herself sharing not just technical advice, but life wisdom. She told them about her own journey, about the loss she had experienced, about the 3 years she had spent away from music. Talent isn't enough, she told one particularly gifted but anxious student. Neither is hard work, though both matter. What you really need is resilience, the ability to keep going when things fall apart, the courage to start over when necessary, the wisdom to know that your worth isn't determined by your success or failure in any single moment. The student, a 17-year-old girl with enormous potential but crippling stage fright, looked at her with wide eyes. But weren't you scared? When you came back after so long? Terrified, Sarah admitted. But I had learned something important during my time away. I had learned that I could survive things I thought would destroy me. My parents' deaths, losing my career, working as a waitress when I had once performed at Carnegie Hall. These things had felt impossible to bear, but I had borne them. So stepping back on stage, that was scary, but I knew I could handle it, whatever the outcome. The masterclass had gone so well that the school offered her a part-time teaching position. Sarah accepted immediately. Teaching provided steady income, but more than that, it gave her a sense of purpose beyond her own career. She was helping shape the next generation of musicians, passing on not just technical knowledge but the emotional and psychological tools they would need to navigate the challenging world of professional music. 3 months after her comeback recital, Sarah received an email that made her hands shake. It was from the artistic director of the Ravinia Festival, one of the most prestigious summer music festivals in the country. They wanted her to perform a full recital as part of their chamber music series, with an option to return the following year for a concerto performance with their orchestra. Sarah called Thomas immediately, barely able to contain her excitement. "This is it," she said. "This is the kind of opportunity that could really launch a sustained career." Ravinia has an international reputation. Critics from major publications attend. Artists who do well there get noticed. "Then you'll need to prepare something special," Thomas said. "What are you thinking for repertoire?" Over the coming weeks, they crafted a program that would showcase Sarah's strengths while also pushing her into new territory. They included pieces she had performed before, like the Beethoven Pathétique, but also challenging new work she had never tackled, including Prokofiev's Seventh Sonata and Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, two of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. The preparation was intense, but Sarah found herself thriving under the pressure. This was different from the desperate scramble of preparing for her comeback recital. Now she was working from a place of confidence rather than fear, building on success rather than trying to reclaim something lost. Maria and several other friends from the Grand Harmony organized a fundraiser to help Sarah travel to and perform at Ravinia. They were amazed at how the community rallied around her, local businesses donating money, music lovers buying tickets to a benefit concert Sarah performed at a small venue. The gesture touched Sarah deeply. These were people who had known her only as a waitress, yet they believed in her and wanted to support her dreams. The night before she left for Ravinia, Sarah had dinner with Thomas, Marcus, and Catherine, the 3 people who had made her comeback possible. They ate at a small Italian restaurant, laughing and sharing stories, the conversation flowing easily. "I want to thank you all," Sarah said, raising her glass of wine. 6 months ago, I was just trying to survive, working shifts and avoiding thinking about everything I had lost. You gave me back my music, but more than that, you gave me back myself. I'll never be able to repay that." "You already have," Marcus said. "Your success is payment enough. And the example you're setting for other artists who face setbacks, for people dealing with loss and grief, that's worth more than you know." Catherine nodded. "I just got confirmation this morning. Based on ticket sales and donor interest, we're creating a new annual series specifically for artists making comebacks or second debuts. We're calling it the Sarah Chen Mitchell Resilience Series. You've inspired something that will help others." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. A series named after her, designed to help artists in situations similar to what she had faced. It was the kind of legacy she had never imagined when she was just trying to get through each day. The Ravinia performance was scheduled for a Saturday evening in June. Sarah arrived 3 days early to acclimate and rehearse in the venue. The outdoor pavilion was magnificent, with seating for thousands under an elegant canopy and on the surrounding lawn. She would be performing in the smaller indoor venue that held about 800 people, but it was still far larger than anything she had played since her return. The night of the performance, Sarah stood backstage feeling a familiar nervousness, but it was manageable now.